The tools used by police to retaliate against me include the illegal placement of items classified by federal government as high risk and active implantable medical devices. High risk because they have a propensity to cause death to their host from rejection and subsequent infection. Active because they vibrate with energy targeting the implantable device wirelessly with radiation or radio waves or microwaves, exactly like the ones used to access your mobile telephones, which is another reason why the government won't act on claims that mobile telephones cause us brain tumours. Active implantable medical devices are used on patients as a last resort. So to use them on a person with no medical need, well then that's prima facie evidence of attempted murder, my attempted murder. I say murder and not manslaughter because the assault was clearly premeditated. The medical doctors who refused to identify these items are guilty as accessories under criminal law. And criminal law says an accessory is treated the same as an offender. But unlike the Irish Republican Army often did, no Australian has the guts to stand up and say they own these implants inside me. So that makes these implants legally mine. I logically presume all medical implants are numbered, like car engines, and that each numbered implant is registered to a medical practitioner, making the identification of the people who left these implants inside me easily traceable in government record. This I consider additional to, not being inconsistent with, my prior evidence uploaded to YouTube. The culmination of my hard evidence proves irrefutable proof of criminal conspiracy between Australian government entities. I was harmed under Freemason law in the 1990s for being raped by a Freemason at age 2 in 1959, which is exactly the same as Sharia law, where women and girls and babies are harmed for being raped. Only Freemason law involves police, medical practitioners and members of the judiciary in Australia. White Australians, traditionally Christian. Exposure of criminal activity in Australian governments is unlawfully discouraged by a number of illegal and legal means, supported secretly or openly by government. The most obvious legal method to squash claims of government criminal activity is to make access to civil courts available only to wealthy people. Police won't investigate any crime that involves criminal activity in government. This is proven by the fact that legal aid is not available to prosecute a breach of your common law rights for personal trespass in actions like assault and battery and unlawful imprisonment. An unlawful imprisonment is not limited to police arrest. Someone can stop you from leaving a place for any reason, and that's unlawful imprisonment. And it also includes being illegally detained under the Mental Health Act. That's unlawful imprisonment. On 9th of July 2010 and 7th of September 2010, I lodged formal complaints. This is an extract of my complaints made to APRA online about radiologist Bill Loftus and ENT specialist Neville Minnis. And the claim goes like this. I went to doctors experiencing extreme pain with what feels like sparking in and around my head and shoulders. The radiologist and ENT failed to note the presence of foreign items seen in the film in and around my skull, despite that the MRI investigation was performed for specific intent to locate any foreign items. End of quotes. APRA's alleged state manager for South Australia, because APRA is a federal organisation, so the state manager for South Australia refused to acknowledge or deny the existence of these 4 complaints, confirming irrefutable proof a criminal conspiracy between Australian government entities intended to pervert the course of justice after allegations of criminal medical battery by Australians. This criminal conspiracy proves the high probability that medical experimental devices funded under Australian medical research programs have been illegally and secretly used in Australia on Australians for many consecutive decades. Mine were implanted in the 1990s. We're now in 2017. One of the symptoms that psychiatrists say is proof that I have a mental illness is that I feel vibrations inside my head, and I hear clicking in my head. However, a free Android app tells me that the clicking I hear in my head and feel is externally audible. So by default, this basic, very free Android app to measure sound proves I have legal implants. So why can't medical practitioners do the same thing? Why don't they have audiology equipment and heat finding equipment to prove somebody has illegal implants? The answer to that simply is because they facilitate the illegal process of medical experimentation in Australia. Australian government officials illegally marginalise people using the mental health industry. They do this for a number of reasons. The prime reason is if you complain about criminal activities in government. One might argue this is the reason the mental health industry has enjoyed so much funding increase while the alleged occurrence of mental health conditions continue to grow exponentially, not decrease. Psychiatrists claim to be able to treat mental illness. However, they don't ever claim they can cure it. But how is a mental illness diagnosed? If a healthy person went into a psychiatrist's office and lied by saying they could hear voices that tell them to do bad things, or said someone wants to harm me, or said they get headaches and have trouble sleeping, then the verbal descriptions, lie or truth, made by these people are enough to have them diagnosed as having a mental illness. No test is ever performed to confirm or refute mental illness because there is no test. It's all theory. There's no logic associated with mental illness. If you don't believe me, try it yourself. Conduct your own mini experiment. I suggest you take some acting classes first. So if you're a victim of government corruption and you mention it to your medical doctor, there's a high probability that they'll diagnose you with a mental illness automatically, because medical practitioners, they refuse to entertain the probability that there's corruption in government because they facilitate the corruption on a day-to-day basis. This diagnosis happen automatically if you say police refuse to investigate the stalking or corruption, or that you say you can't afford a lawyer to sue them in court, or that you don't know who's stalking you or causing you harm. So you'll automatically be deemed as having a mental illness. Like I said, if you don't believe me, try it yourself. On a similar subject, Australians have been preened from an early age to be stoic in various situations. This means that we've been taught to be passive and indifferent to somebody that hurts us. We actually do it accidentally to our children. When the siblings fight, we tell them to forgive each other and kiss and make up. Don't realise the long-term effect that that's having on society. Publicly, the press and the government try to make us stoic, presumably to make us less inclined to civil war. They do this so that we don't complain when they harm us. Our government expects us to underreact to crime, especially when the crime happens to us. Being stoic means that if you're beaten half to death, you're meant to get up off the ground, smile broadly, brush yourself off, forgive your assailant, and sometimes forgive them with hugs and kisses. You see this absurdity everywhere. Specifically, you see it the most in Facebook and other social media places when they talk about forgiving people who have killed hundreds of people. I'm not stoic, but I'm not aggressive either. What I expect is to have my common law rights addressed in both criminal and civil law courts. I expect people to take my complaints in writing, to address my complaints seriously, to investigate my complaints which have very convincing elements of proof, and to take my complaints to a criminal court. And then I expect to be able to prosecute the people in a civil court to get financial reimbursement for the pain and suffering. Despite the fact that this is supposed to happen in Australia, it only happens in theory. Australian public officers are actively obstructing our right to access redress under Australian law using passive-aggressive techniques against us. When an Australian refuses to be stoic after a brutal assault like me and the many physical attacks I've suffered, we're branded as being antisocial or aggressive or mentally ill. Non-compliant or non-stoic Australians are usually publicly branded like this in the press. We're privately branded this way in government records. Such false and baseless claims have been made about me in state police records and state health records, and also in Centrelink records, I might add. All without any base in truth, all without any corresponding evidence, and all on hearsay. After some of my assailants baselessly claimed in 2007 that I threatened to shoot an unidentified person with a gun to facilitate my illegal detention in Royal Adelaide Hospital under the State Mental Health Act, because the state government couldn't be bothered to get a psychiatrist to come and talk to me within 12 hours. So I was held for 12 hours and then released when a psychiatrist, Mr. Kneebone, came and spoke to me. So for 5 years, I didn't know that this person had claimed I had threatened to shoot someone. Under the Mental Health Act, they're supposed to give you the documents, all the documents, but the state government refused to give me anything. The state government of South Australia, the Crown, harboured this person who criminally defamed me for 5 consecutive years without letting me know I'd been criminally defamed, despite the fact that under legislation they had to tell me. So then when I got the evidence that I'd been criminally defamed, the court that this evidence was produced in automatically decided that the hearsay was fact without any corresponding evidence. And even despite the fact that police didn't even investigate me for this alleged gun crime. So then in court records, I was that claim that I had threatened to shoot somebody with a gun was confirmed. The state government refused to correct the intentional defamations in my records attached to my name in breach of federal government privacy legislation, which also means South Australia Police Department public officers facilitate criminal defamation in breach of state criminal law. And our police also criminally harbour South Australian Health Department public officials who criminally defame us in state health records. Now, this isn't just an open-ended statement. I can prove this irrefutably 100%. I've been criminally defamed in government record this way because I complain about the tools used to retaliate against me for ex-police officer Jack Bassett's suicide in New South Wales in southern Sydney. The dead cop who suddenly got a guilty conscience 26 years after turning his back on a 2-year-old victim of crime just so happened to be me. ABC TV Four Corners program ran a story in Adelaide, South Australia on the 12th of June 2017, last night. This was about a story ex-ABC reporter Chris Masters made about 30 years ago. So this modern remake of a 30-year-old story appears to be intended to con Australians out of the truth of Australian history. A history that continues today. Christopher Masters went into great detail to explain that a crime syndicate in Queensland, Australia, was known as the Joke. They may have well been a joke. However, I'm the daughter of a New South Wales Freemason. I've only known my father as a Freemason. I have blood relatives in Queensland on my mother's side, but blood relatives in New South Wales on my father's side, both sides dating back to 17th century arrival in Australia. My grandmother, Jane Gorvin Hussey, was murdered by Freemasons in 1922 near Charters Towers, Queensland, for her stance against Freemason sex crimes involving her children. In the 1980s, I was attacked by Freemasons in southern Sydney for my stance against sex crimes involving Freemasons and my children. For Chris Masters to infer that police in Australia in the last century were not Freemasons is a threat to all Australians. Freemasons were probably more ferocious in their sex crimes against children last century because of their high profile membership, much more ferocious than the churches. This conspiracy to murder me since about 1985 is directly connected to Sydney Freemasons who were also police, medical practitioners, lawyers, members of parliament, judiciary, and probably news reporters. Police include federal police, where it's highly likely Jack Bassett's son is or was a federal police officer.